Hey guys, so for today's video we're looking at the legendary Jeep Cherokee XJ. So for these types of videos I look at the history of the car, major flaws, and why it got cancelled. I'm slowly making my way through most of the Mopar vehicles. I've probably done at least 15 to 20 of them by now, so check that playlist out in the top right corner if you want more of these episodes. Over the last few months I've seen a lot of people ask about the Cherokee XJ, so here we go. So in these videos, the first part focuses on looking back at the history of the car, and then we jump to talking about the events that led to the car being cancelled and any flaws that it had. The Cherokee was around for a whopping 18 model years from 1984 to 2001. Jeep did revive the Cherokee nameplate from 2014 to the present day with the Cherokee KL, but we won't be talking about that today. As for the Cherokee XJ, it had two main, we'll call them generations, the first from 1984 to 1996, and the second from 1997 until 2001, after getting a restyling inside and out. So let's begin back in 1984 when the XJ Cherokee was launched as a compact sport utility vehicle. It was available in several configurations, like 3, 4, or 5 passengers, front engine, and rear or 4-wheel drive. It was Jeep's first all-new design since the 1963 SJ Wagoneer, as well as the first American off-road vehicle built with a unibody design. The existing SJ platform with the Cherokee and wood-themed Wagoneer was getting outdated fast and needed replacing. The newer vehicle would need to be lighter and more efficient, as there was a federal mandate that all 4-wheel drive vehicles needed to average 15 miles per gallon by 1981. Unfortunately, developing that wouldn't be easy. To get a better picture of how the XJ Cherokee came to be, we have to do a little bit of digging on the Jeep brand. Of course, things were vastly different back in the 1970s and 80s with respect to Jeep. Now it's been a part of Chrysler for several decades, but back then it was American Motors Corporation, or AMC, who purchased the Jeep operations in 1970 for $70 million US from Kaiser Motors, and shockingly, the Jeep branded vehicles were a money-losing operation at this time. AMC wasn't doing so hot themselves by the early 1980s, lacking capital and resources to produce new modern products, and their applications to receive more credit from the banks were refused. That's where the French company Renault came in, first with a joint manufacturing and distribution agreement in 1978, then a cash injection of $150 million US and another $50 million in credits in 1979. This meant that Renault would play a key role in the financing, designing, engineering, and building of several vehicles including the XJ. Back in 1978, AMC and Renault engineers sketched out some ideas for a new Jeep, and they even built some clay models. Later on, Renault even sent one of their design heads, Francois Casting, to oversee the AMC product development team, and he helped design this new XJ Jeep platform, with the exterior styling done by AMC Vice President of Design, Dick Teague. And to make a long story short and tie up some loose ends, Chrysler would later acquire AMC in August of 1987, inheriting the Jeep brand and the Cherokee XJ in the process. So that's a little bit of intel of how the Cherokee XJ came to fruition during tough financial times for AMC. Now we can move to the next part of the video, looking at the trim levels. The Cherokee XJ had a whopping 14 different trim levels over its long life. Upon release in 1983, the XJ cost about $10,000 US, and base prices remained around the $12,000 range for many years. Moving on to 1991, where we have more financial information, prices started around $13,000 US for the 2-door base model, and you can add around $1,000 for 4-door models and $1,500 extra for 4-wheel drive. Middle of the pack is the Sport, with the 4-door 4-wheel drive Sport model coming in at under $17,000. At the top, the Limited was over $25,000. When adjusted for inflation in 2021 USD, prices range from $26,000 to over $50,000, suggesting that the 2-door lower-end models targeted first-time buyers and those with less disposable income, while the more premium vehicles with 4 doors and 4-wheel drive were targeting the wealthier middle-upper-class citizens. Looking at another year in 1996, the prices haven't really changed with the times, sticking at under $15,000 for the base SE and $22,000 for the 4-door country model with 4-wheel drive. By the final year of production, the lineup had been trimmed quite a bit, leaving prices in the range of $19,000 to $23,000. Here's a quick summary chart with most of the trim levels and the years that they were offered. There were also a few special edition models, such as the 2000 Freedom Edition and 2001 60th Anniversary Edition. It's also worth noting that in 1985, Jeep added a 2-wheel drive version for most trim levels, as we saw, the first time Jeep had done that since 1967, in hopes of attracting some buyers who didn't need the 4-wheel drive or didn't want to pay the extra money for it. Now for the exterior, it was designed keeping Europe in mind, as Renault had wanted to sell the Cherokee over there, needing to meet their expectations with a lighter vehicle with better fuel economy. That resulted in the new XJ being 1,200 pounds lighter, 31 inches shorter, 6 inches narrower, and 4 inches lower than the previous Cherokee SJ. Overall, it weighed just under 3,200 pounds and had a length of 166.9 inches. This was possible thanks to its unibody construction, with a ladder box chassis integrated into a single monocoque unit consisting of 3,200 welds, instead of the traditional body-on-frame construction. 2- and 4-door models both had the same track and wheelbase. This was an entirely different approach from Ford and GM, who chose to keep the traditional body-on-frame design and just shorten those pickups instead. But that meant that the S10 Blazer and Bronco 2 both weighed a few hundred pounds more than the Cherokee XJ. The Cherokee XJ was a pioneer for the new segment of sport utility vehicles, or SUVs, which wasn't really defined as such during the early days of the XJ. Jeep would actually market them as Sportwagons instead, replacing the station wagon as it cannibalized the sales from regular cars. Dick Teague, who was the exterior designer, described the SUV's appearance in 1983 right before it came out, saying, quote, "We didn't want to lose the flavor of the older Jeeps. We wanted to look like something you'd take into the rough country," end quote. In my eyes, it's such an iconic design, less truck-like than the SJ, perfectly boxy, with the body blended into the frame. Automobile Magazine agrees, as they said it was, quote, "possibly the best SUV shape of all time. It is the paradigmatic model to which other designers have since aspired," end quote. Jeep let 13 model years pass by before they updated the exterior styling for the 1997 and up models, but they mostly preserved the timeless design. Jeep restyled the headlight bezels, taillights, plastic moldings on the doors, wheel flares, and rear hatch, while adding a steel liftgate instead of a fiberglass one. Other changes were made at the factory to improve build quality, with better panel gaps, closer tolerances, and revised paint quality. 15 by 7 inch wheels were used throughout its life, with P215/75 R15 tires, but Jeep did add a 16 inch wheel option for 2000 and 2001. The interior of the Cherokee XJ was never particularly upscale, but it offered lots of room and comfort, something that we've come to expect from Jeep. The XJ was also able to keep 90% of its predecessor's interior volume despite its smaller size, thanks to that unibody construction from Francois Kesting. The center rail front seats for the first several years were also lighter, taken directly from the Renault 9, 11, and Alliance, with leather or cloth options. 2-door models received longer doors and front seats that could fold forward to help the passengers get in and out. Just like the exterior, the interior is restyled for the 1997 to 2001 models, with a new instrument panel, higher mounted audio and climate controls, dual airbags, 2 cup holders, and new door panels. That instrument panel featured a unique cluster and airbag bracket that allowed for easy interchangeability, so that the XJ could be sold in both right-hand and left-hand drive markets. And more on that later. A stiffer unibody frame was created to reduce the noise, vibration, and harshness, and new door seals were added to reduce wind noise. Moving on to the performance, there were a wide variety of engines, transmissions, transfer cases, and axles available. So first we'll look at the 5 different engines. The standard engine was the 2.5-liter AMC 150 coming on the 1984 to 1985 Cherokees, with a 1-barrel Carter-Weber carburetor, cast iron block and head, and uniside flow cylinder heads. Originally it made 105 horsepower and 132 pound-feet of torque, but that was continually improved once it became fuel injected, bumped up every couple of years all the way to 130 horsepower and 149 pound-feet of torque by 1996. The engine continued along from 1997 to 2000 with 125 horsepower and 150 pound-feet of torque before it was removed for the final year in 2001. The other 4-cylinder options were both diesel, the first a 2.1-liter turbo diesel Douvrant J8S engine from Renault. It was fairly short-lived, offered from 1985 to 1987 in North America, and until 1994 globally. It made 85 horsepower and 132 pound-feet of torque, featuring an extremely high 21.5 to 1 compression ratio. The other diesel was a 2.5-liter VM Motori 425 turbo diesel, introduced later on the 1994 Cherokee, and that stuck around right until the end in 2001. It had just 114 horsepower, but compensated with 221 pound-feet of torque. Moving up to 6 cylinders from 1984 to 1986, Jeep would offer a V6 from GM, the 2.8-liter LR2. It used a 2-barrel Rochester carburetor with an open-loop design and had a 60-degree angle opposed to the more common 90 degrees. This engine made between 110 to 115 horsepower and 145 to 150 pound-feet of torque. 1987 saw the radiator support change for more clearance and the firewall being adjusted, allowing for AMC to replace the GM V6 with one that some argue is the best AMC ever designed, the 4-liter 242 inline-six cylinder, also known as the 4-liter PowerTech. This was first offered in 1987 for the XJ and continued right through until 2001 with only a few tuning upgrades. It had high-flow heads and multi-port fuel injection, resulting in an original output of 173 horsepower and 220 pound-feet of torque. A high-output version was born in 1991, giving all subsequent models a nice boost, 190 to 193 horsepower and 225 to 231 pound-feet of torque. The 4-liter was widely regarded as a spectacular engine that was very durable, lasting well past 200,000 miles. Performance times weren't blistering fast, but they were decent for a Jeep. Models with the 2.5-liter AMC engine could do 0 to 60 in 10.5 seconds, with a quarter mile in 17.5 seconds. With the 4-liter inline-six, those numbers improved to 8.2 seconds to 60 miles per hour and 16.2 seconds in the quarter mile. Now, to go along with the 6 engines, there were also 10 different transmissions that I'll post on screen so you can follow along better, including 4 and 5-speed manuals and 3 and 4-speed automatics. So upon release, the XJ received a Borg-Warner T4 4-speed standard with the 2.5-liter AMC engine, and the T5 5-speed manual was standard with the 2.8-liter V6. It looks like the Borg-Warners were only used for the first year in 1984, replaced by the Aisin AX4 4-speed and AX5 5-speed for the next several years. There were various other 5-speed manuals used, like a Peugeot BA105, Aisin AX15, and New Venture Gear NV3550 for the 2.5-liter and 4-liter inline-six as well. As for the automatics, Chrysler began with the optional A904 3-speed from 1984 to 1986 for the 2.5-liter and 2.8-liter engines, while the 4-liter engine came with the Aisin Warner AW4 4-speed automatic throughout its life. There was also another Chrysler 3-speed from 1994 to 2000 on the 2.5-liter. The gearing ratios varied with different transmissions, engines, and axles, from 3.07 to 1 all the way to 4.56 to 1. Now looking to the transfer cases, early models had the NP207 and NP228 part-time or the NP229 full-time options, all with a 2.61 to 1 ratio with low range. From 1987 until 2000, the improved NP231 Command Track and NP242 Select Track were used with a 2.72 to 1 low range, more selectable settings, and a wide range of aftermarket support like 4 to 1 gear reduction kits, slip yoke eliminators, and wide chain upgrades. As for the axles, to provide better off-road performance and abilities, front and rear solid axles were used instead of independent. Most were Dana 30 high pinion front axles with a vacuum disconnect, but the last few years of production switched over to the weaker low pinion Dana 30, and some of the later models between 1991 to 2000 used the 29 spline Chrysler 8.25-inch rear axle. Finally, as for the suspension, up front there was the Quadra-Link setup with 4 leading control arms, 2 above and 2 below the axle. On top of the axle housing there were 2 coil springs and 2 gas shock absorbers. The rear used leaf springs with 2 gas shock absorbers and an anti-sway bar. Now, before we look at the flaws and cancellation part of the video, there are a few other things I wanted to talk about, like the Wagoneer, Comanche, fleet markets, and global sales. So there were a few variations of the Cherokee XJ. First, there's the Jeep Comanche MJ from 1985 to 1992, which had its body, styling, engineering, and drivetrain all based on the XJ Cherokee. It kept the unibody construction of the Cherokee in the front of the vehicle and had the traditional body-on-frame design behind the cab. There was also the 1984 to 1990 Jeep Wagoneer. While technically it was just a different trim level, AMC did consider it to be an entirely separate model and not actually a Cherokee. It was also totally unrelated to the similarly named full-size Jeep Grand Wagoneer. The Wagoneer could be had in 2 trims of its own, a regular version and a Wagoneer Limited. The 1984 to 1985 Wagoneer had different grille and emblems, and the 1986 to 1990 versions had stacked-up headlights with another grille change. One of the appeals on the limited trim was the vinyl wood laminate decals on the outside and the maple wood trim on the inside. As for the next topic, the XJ was actually fairly popular for the fleet market, with a 1992 police package and a 1996 SE model for police and other government fleet use. So that was a bare-bones model with no interior rear door handles, but it did have the high-output 4-liter inline-six engine instead of the typical 4 cylinders that were found in the SE. Interestingly, Jeep did create right-hand drive Cherokees for the United States Postal Service, who have many vehicles in right-hand drive to give their drivers the easiest access to roadside mailboxes. And that also allowed Jeep to sell the XJ in the United Kingdom and Ireland beginning in 1993. 1997 saw the addition of a Cherokee Special Service package, available right until the cancellation. As for some global sales, the XJ was sold abroad, notably in Europe and China. It was introduced to left-hand drive European markets in 1985, and as we said, right-hand drive markets in 1993, and sales continued right up until 2001. After that, the North American Jeep Liberty KJ was also sold globally, but it kept the Cherokee nameplate overseas, despite it really being a Liberty. There were also some odd XJ vans in some Euro markets that was a workaround for motor tax regulations, seeing as they would be used for commercial use instead of passenger. The vans were actually quite a bit different, with metal panels instead of rear windows, a flat cargo area with no rear seats, and the 2.5-liter Via Motori diesel with the Aisin AX15 5-speed manual transmission. The other major market, China, began when AMC had a joint venture manufacturing plant in Beijing. Models were still really similar to the US versions, but they had different names, like a rear-wheel drive BJ 7250 and the four-wheel drive BJ 2021. The BJ 2021 was actually meant to be a chauffeur vehicle with a raised roof in the rear for passengers to feel like they were sitting above the driver. Similar combinations of powertrains were used for the Chinese vehicles as the American ones. Those models were available until 2005, but Beijing Auto Works would continue production from 2009 until 2014, calling the XJ Cherokee the BAW Qixi, or Knight in English translation. So when it was all said and done, the XJ was a truly legendary vehicle that was extremely popular, selling over 3 million vehicles globally, with sales peaking in 1999 in the United States, with over 165,000 units moved. It was manufactured in 5 different countries: the US, China, Argentina, Egypt, and Venezuela. It was even supposed to be replaced by the Jeep Grand Cherokee in 1993, but Chrysler ended up keeping the XJ until 2001 due to its popularity. This vehicle brought enthusiasts together, took many people off-road, and was worshipped by automotive journalists. Unfortunately, the Cherokee XJ was canceled and production ended in June of 2001 at the Toledo South Assembly Plant. So that'll bring us to the next part of the video, looking at the reasoning for the cancellation and the flaws of the Cherokee XJ. I've come up with 8 different reasons and or flaws that refer to the car or Chrysler decision making and decision executions. So let's look at those reasons now. So one of the major reasons for the cancellation of the Cherokee XJ was due to new changes from Wolfgang Bernhard. He was the CEO of Mercedes-AMG in 1999, and following the Daimler-Chrysler merger, he became president and chief operating officer of Chrysler the following year in 2000. One of his objectives was to help turn around Chrysler by cutting costs. So one of the first things he did in 2000 was to help kill the Jeep Cherokee, a vehicle that he called, quote, an aging, somewhat bland SUV, end quote. He didn't see a need to continue spending money on this older SUV, discontinuing the XJ after 2001 and replacing it with the Jeep Liberty KJ. Up until the 21st century, the Jeep brand had always been focusing on building and promoting 4x4 models that offered customers some serious off-road performance and capabilities. They were built rugged and tough like we saw with the XJ, with things like solid axles and low-range transfer cases that were great for off-roading, but also did sacrifice comfort and drivability on the road. Chrysler Group and Wolfgang Bernhard again wanted to expand the Jeep lineup to move away from the brand's historic off-road roots. In a press event in 2003, he said, quote, we have to extend our lineup and offer Jeeps that will be used 99% of the time on-road, end quote. And there was also a stat that came out saying that only 1 in 10 SUV owners take their vehicles off the road. So why would Jeep continue with a vehicle that didn't really fit what their target market was looking for? The XJ was a total beast off-road, but on the road it was mediocre. 25% of Jeep owners still did like driving off-road, according to another stat, so this reflected a decision to expand into the real 4x4 world, where they kept some rugged off-road SUVs, but also added some smooth riding and comfortable vehicles to their lineup. So with this product strategy, Jeep could appeal to the mass markets, while not fully turning their back to those that love Jeep for the heritage and off-roading capabilities. And of course, the Cherokee XJ just didn't fit that mix going forward. Another reason for needing to get rid of the Cherokee XJ and re-energize the Jeep brand would be that their market share had been trending in a concerning direction. Jeep had held a 19% market share of the United States SUV market in 1999, with over 550,000 sales, but that fell over 41% by 2002, down to just 11.2% market share, which was around 450,000 sales within the growing SUV market. Another key reason was that despite sales of the XJ still being pretty steady going into the 2000s, it was just getting really old. The engines were aging fast and it was difficult to add more power and reduce emissions, as Chrysler had already added features like fuel injection and computer controls. The technology used was archaic and the interior wasn't modern. The styling was becoming obsolete as well, as it was appreciated by Jeep enthusiasts but outdated according to modern standards. Daimler Chrysler saw more modern designs from the likes of the Honda CR-V and Toyota RAV4, and they adjusted accordingly by replacing the Cherokee XJ with the Jeep Liberty in 2002. As we mentioned, with 90% of SUV owners never taking their vehicles off the road, there wasn't a huge demand for that sort of thing, so the Liberty didn't need to be an off-road beast to have success in the market. The Liberty was the first new Jeep to feature an independent suspension since the 1963 Wagoneer, and that allowed for better handling and cornering, improved stability and steering, enhanced ride comfort, and less weight, which all catered to the newer trend of SUVs. Another important factor here was the tooling for the future. Chrysler was building new PowerTech engines, first a 4.7-liter V8 that debuted in the 1999 Jeep Grand Cherokee. This was meant to replace the Chrysler LA engines, the 5.2-liter and 5.9-liter Magnum V8s. There was also a companion V6 mechanically very similar to the V8, and that would be the 3.7-liter V6, first found in that 2002 Jeep Liberty, the successor to the Cherokee XJ. So these new PowerTech engines had nothing in common with the 4-liter inline-six engine found in the XJ, and due to their similar designs, they could be machined using the same tooling equipment, resulting in huge economies of scale and cost saving for Chrysler, making it easier and cheaper to scrap their older engines from the XJ. Also, another thing with the 4-liter engine was that the emissions were too high, as it was very smog unfriendly, and the costs were deemed too high to transform that old engine to meet the current federal emissions. Daimler Chrysler had a few different options: either keep the Cherokee XJ alive with the new PowerTech V6, or discontinue the Cherokee and the 4-liter engine entirely. The marketing team concluded that Cherokee buyers would not have accepted it with a V6, which seems ridiculous as it had a GM V6 earlier on in its life. But that was simply another thing that made it easier to cancel. Another common issue worth talking about is the death wobble, affecting many Jeep Wranglers and Jeep Cherokee XJs. Death wobble typically occurs at speeds above 45 miles per hour, and it usually gets triggered by hitting a bump or a pothole. And the result is a violent wobble feeling that will cause shaking and vibration in the front of the vehicle and the steering wheel. It's called the death wobble because it feels like the entire Jeep is about to fall apart, so it's not minor vibrations like you'd get from an unbalanced tire. The problem is caused by loose or damaged steering components, so to diagnose it, all of the steering and front suspension parts need to be checked for damage and replaced if needed. This usually affects XJs that have upgraded suspensions or lift kits, but it can also happen to any stock Jeeps with a solid front axle. As is the case with many vehicles, usually the first couple of years are the most problematic in terms of reliability, and so some examples here include the transfer case, engines, and transmissions. So the early pre-1987 Cherokees had the NP207, NP228, and NP229 transfer case options, but as we mentioned way back in the video, these were slightly weaker and had little aftermarket support. The early Warner AX4 and AX5 manual transmissions were also really weak, while the 1987 to 1989 Peugeot BA105 manual was very poorly built and prone to failing. And lastly, the 4-liter inline-six had various cooling system problems during its first run. Now the final thing to talk about, as we do in most of these episodes, is some other various issues that are pretty common, but these aren't really huge flaws and wouldn't at all be responsible for the cancellation of the vehicle. The 4-liter engine was revered for its longevity and durability, but it did have a rear main seal leak problem and was never properly fixed, as well as a problematic closed-loop cooling system on the early models, and heads that are known to crack on the last two model years, 2000 and 2001. Rust was a serious problem of the cars during this era, especially for vehicles that lived through damp climates and cold, salty winters, and the XJ was no exception. This is a pretty important fix, as steel is structural on a unibody vehicle, and it can seriously affect the rocker panels and floor. Some of the paint quality on the first generation until 1996 wasn't great either, as it would blister on the hood and roof. Now for some electrical issues, the wires in the driver's side door jamb are too short and can break easily from opening and closing the door. That leads to non-functioning door locks, power windows, and speakers. The available power driver's seat, and for 2001 the passenger seat, have plastic gears that also fail. And finally, there are many reports that the XJ won't start in park or unless you wiggle the shifter, and that cause would be a dirty or corroded neutral safety switch. That's supposed to prevent the starter from engaging when the shifter is in any position other than park or neutral, but often they get dirty and corroded, which causes the contacts in the switch to not read which position it's in, therefore not allowing the starter to engage when it should be. So that's the end of this video, guys. Thanks for watching and hopefully you enjoyed it. I know it was long, one of the longest videos that I've ever done on this topic, but it had to be in order to cover everything properly for the legendary Cherokee XJ. So what do you guys think about this vehicle? Did you ever own one and how was your experience? And were there other reasons for its cancellation that I missed? Let me know down in the comment section below. Make sure to like and subscribe for more Mopar content, and I'll see you guys in the next video.